like to thank all of you for coming to this event. We from the Talk for Pak team would like to present first the work we've been doing. So I would like to invite Riazak Saab to come on stage and give his talk about what we've been doing on Talk for Pak platform. And if those of you who have not gotten the lunch, please do so, because it will wrap up around 1:30. So I think we have half an hour more to go. I think Mustafa, I think we have half an hour.
Yeah,
more.
we have half an hour.
Okay. So
We can always, if you don't want to disturb the program, we can go around.
So Rasa, you're on.
Good morning. Welcome you all to this event organized by our platform Talk to Talk. The purpose of our platform that we've set up is called Talk for Talk is basically a media platform that is intended to act as a bridge between the Pakistani diaspora here in the United States and our country of birth for many of us. As you know, we're living in a time of monumental change. There has been change in government in the United States, in Pakistan, in India, and many parts of Europe in recent years, in the last year, 2, 3. Where we've seen the rise of extreme nationalism and populism, and we've also seen a lot of Islamophobia, xenophobia. We're trying to deal with some of these issues, and one of the things we do in Talk for Talk is we bring in guests to discuss these things that have an impact on our community, the Pakistani-American community here in the United States. One of the things, for example, that we did after the Trump election was we invited a white nationalist by the name of Jared Taylor to our show to try and understand what drives this movement. Why, in fact, but the basic question we asked him, why do you hate us? What's the problem? What have we done to you that makes you so angry? And he was very forthright, you know. I think you should watch that show that we had with him, which is available on our YouTube channel, Viewpoint from Overseas. In addition, we've had a whole range of guests from different parts of the political spectrum. And we've had people like Dr. Adil Najam. Today we have Dr. Moeed Yusuf. Moeed Yusuf has also been on our show on several occasions in the past. And then we've talked to activists, journalists, analysts, intellectuals, public intellectuals, as well as people, thinkers, people who can help us understand what is going on around us right now so we can better deal with it. So I invite you all to take a look at our programs that we have been putting together. There are two titles under which we record. One title is Viewpoint from Overseas, which is a regular weekly show that we record. It's in English, the Viewpoint from Overseas. Then there's another one that we called Azad Labo Ke Saath, and that is actually in Urdu. And we actually broadcast it live on Facebook, and we also make it available on our Viewpoint from Overseas channel. There are several of us. I think I'd like to recognize people who are participating in this platform, our regulars, our principals. Of course, we have Misbah Azam. Misbah, would you please stand up? Misbah is one of our key principals in this group, Talk for Pak group. Then we have Faraz Darvesh, who's part of it. He's actually the anchor. He's the guy who asks all the tough questions. And we have Sabahat Ashraf. Sabahat, are you here? Yeah. And one of us, Ali Al-Sazan Sabatur right now is actually touring Russia. He's an interesting guy. You meet him in the morning and you don't know what he's going to do next. And then in the afternoon, he's doing a show directly from the Red Square in front of Kremlin talking about what's going on in Russia. So I call him my footloose friend. He just takes off without notice. So he's not here today. So I welcome you all to this event, and I hope that you will support our platform, Talk for Pak, and help us build it. Thank you.
Thank you, Riaz. And then next, I would like to invite Dr. Misbah Azam Sahab. Please come on the stage and introduce Dr. Moeed Yusuf Sahab.
Hello, everyone. Respected ladies and gentlemen, greetings. It's a very nice weekend, nice weather outside. I would give a very brief introduction of the book, and then I will have my friend Dr. Yusuf come here and join and talk about his thesis. The threat of nuclear war is among the most excruciating problems the world is facing now. The odds of the nuclear conflict is growing after different countries gain the nuclear capabilities. The Cold War model of dealing with the nuclear threats do not take into account the regional conflicts. Brokering Peace in Nuclear Environment, that is the book by Moeed Yusuf, and anybody of you would like to buy it, you are most welcome to buy it. Dr. Yusuf would sign on it. The book offers an innovative theory of brokered bargaining to better understand and solve the regional crisis, like we saw it in the case of India and Pakistan, of Kargil crisis, the Twin Peak crisis, and then later on the Mumbai crisis. It is just an example which is being given in this book in a very interesting details, and the role of the third party is being described there. Luckily, the author of this brilliant thesis, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, is here among us to discuss his theories. He puts out in 10 propositions as factors shaping the third party's crisis behavior. I am honored to introduce my friend, a young, brilliant Pakistani-American scholar, a public intellectual, an associate vice president of South Asian program of U.S. Institute of Peace, Dr. Moeed Yusuf. I'm sorry. Hello, Moeed. Before I hand the podium to Moeed, I would like to mention that this visit to the Bay Area was not sponsored by the USIP, but he kindly agreed to visit on Talk for Pak invitation. So Moeed, that is something he wanted me to tell the people. So ladies and gentlemen, Moeed Yusuf.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum all. Good afternoon, and Mr. Saab, thank you for the invitation. And yes, this is not USIP, this is because you asked me and I'm here. And thank you all for joining. By the way, before we begin, on a lighter note, this is not the first time the wrong Moeed has been mentioned. The Moeed and the other Moeed. We keep joking. We've also had instances where people have sent us the wrong air ticket to fly somewhere for a conference. So it happens often. Unfortunately, he gets all my invitations and doesn't tell me. No, I'm joking. Okay. I want to do three things based on what we discussed before I came. I'll briefly talk about the book, If the people are more interested in this than what I say, I'm happy to talk more. You can sort of look at the book. But then I also want to talk a little bit about U.S. Pakistan and India Pakistan in the space that we're in, because I assume that's going to be of interest to the audience. I'll try and make it brief as much as possible, but let's see where we end up. The book itself, very simply put, is looking at India-Pakistan crisis since the nuclear tests of 1998. So we have had Kargil, then there was this 2001-2002 military standoff for about 10 months where we had 1 million soldiers on the border, India and Pakistan. Mumbai terrorist attacks, 2008. And then we had this surgical strikes episode in 2016 where India claimed to have conducted surgical strikes. And the reason I study this is that so far everything we know about countries with nuclear weapons and their crisis behavior comes from the Cold War. And in the Cold War, there was essentially the US and the Soviet Union who had the crises, Cuban Missile Crisis and many others. The big difference in the India-Pakistan context and in others like North Korea, Israel, tomorrow maybe a nuclear Iran, is that these are not the strongest countries in the world. So they always have other stronger powers that influence their crisis and their behavior. So this entire book unpacks what the US did during these crises, what the Chinese did during these crises, how were the crises played out, how did India and Pakistan react, and what happened at the end of the day in terms of the risk of nuclear war. That's essentially what the book unpacks. So, and it goes into great detail of how each crisis played out and who did what. If you were to put it colloquially, the book addresses a usual conversation in Pakistan, which is that America ultimately dictates and dominates everything that happens in the country. Indians have a fairly similar view, and sort of I look at how true that is and how this plays out. What I can do here in the brief time is maybe lay out 3 or 4 key conclusions that will be provocative and counterintuitive, and I'm happy to have a conversation around that, and then I'll sort of leave the book and move to the US and sort of India part of this. The first thing I'll tell you I found in this book is that, by the way, does everybody speak Urdu or are there people who don't? Everybody speaks Urdu, okay. So I'll also go back and forth between Urdu and English. This conversation that we have in Pakistan about we don't trust the US. Pakistan doesn't trust the US, relationship is bad, US always comes and supports India, etc. So why should we use the US as a third-party mediator? India, of course, has a much greater allergy to the idea of a third party. I mean, their stated position is no US involvement to mediate between India and Pakistan. The first thing I find is that in crisis moments, not in peacetime, in crisis moments after nuclear weapons came into existence in South Asia, both India and Pakistan very eagerly use these third parties, stronger third parties, to come and de-escalate the crisis tensions. And the reason for that is that India and Pakistan after 1998 themselves have also made the right calculation that they do not want war, because war can actually get very dangerous with nuclear weapons. And so the entire crisis is about getting the US to get concessions from the opponent. Rather than directly going after the opponent, it is about getting the US and China and other third parties to say, I will behave myself if you go to my opponent and get me this, this, and this. And that gives the US a central position in managing the crisis. Now, both India and Pakistan deny that they do this, by the way. And why do they deny it is a very important one. The public justification of getting nuclear weapons, if those of you who remember 1998 and the conversations around that, one of the public justifications of India and Pakistan for getting nuclear weapons was strategic independence. आज के बाद we are not going to be dependent on it. हमें कोई dictate नहीं कर सकता. US can't say, nobody can say anything to us. We are now nuclear powers. And one of the difficult, provocative conclusions in my book is that actually India and Pakistan have become more dependent, not less dependent on the third parties during crises. It's almost become a second nature for the US to show up during crises to mediate, and Pakistan and India to play the game through the US. The other important thing I find is that trust in the third party is not important. The reason you engage the third party as India and Pakistan is not trust. It is the perceived influence and leverage the third party has, either to get you concessions from your opponent or to punish you for what you're doing. So if you feel कि यार अगर मैं इनको नाराज करूंगा तो मेरे साथ ये हो सकता है, वो हो सकता है, or if you feel that they can get me the concessions that I'm looking for, that's when you actually engage the third party. There was not a single day in the 1998 to 2016 period that I studied that either India or Pakistan, either one of them, thought that the US was honest and trustworthy. Both felt that the US was actually siding with the other side. And yet they very eagerly used the US because that was the easiest way to get an end to the crisis while trying to get concessions from the other side. The other point to note here is that the US and the Chinese actually coordinate and collaborate their strategies during a crisis. So हमारी जितनी गुफ्तगू है आजकल in Pakistan that US not needed because China is here now and China. If you look at Chinese behavior since 1998 and if you look at US behavior, in the crisis moment, both sides join hands to try and de-escalate the tensions at the moment rather than backing their partners and allies in the region. And this is one of the big frustrations that India has, that the US does not come and support India against Pakistan, even though the language India uses is of terrorism, which is of course a major problem for the US globally post 9/11. In reality, in the crisis, the third parties play down the middle. Their first ask of India and Pakistan is, you need to de-escalate tensions, full stop. After that, we will see what we can do for you. So, for Pakistan and India, if the hope is that China or the US will come and support us against the other, that is very unlikely to happen. In fact, if India and Pakistan push too hard, they may find their partners going the other way. And if you look at Chinese behavior since Kargil, it's been very clear that in a crisis moment, they will not come and support Pakistan against India. They will not support India. And for the US as well, if you look at every crisis, India is very upset at the US since Kargil, saying, you don't come and support me even if you say that terrorism is a big problem and shared concern and whatever. A couple of other things, and then I'll shift. One, there is this conversation about India and Pakistan being rational, so why do we need third parties? Why can't we do this on our own? The reason for that is not irrationality. Actually, India and Pakistan are as rational as anybody else. The reason for that is that we have not been able to come up with direct bilateral mechanisms to manage our crisis. We have hotlines. The militaries also have hotlines at the tactical level. We have many other channels we can use directly. But in a crisis, the first thing we give up on are these direct channels. Because it is actually more beneficial for India and Pakistan to try and use the third party to get you concessions rather than have to talk to each other where the trust levels are so low. And so every time we say, oh, we don't actually need the third party, that is completely untrue. And I'll tell you something interesting. When I wrote this book, I interviewed about close to 100 people who were sort of presidents, prime ministers, actual crisis managers in US, India and Pakistan. All of them told me what you're saying is not true. India and Pakistan said, we don't use the third party. The US said, they're sovereign countries, we only help if they ask. When I started putting evidence in front of these people, then they quietly told me, look, everything you're saying is absolutely correct, we cannot acknowledge it. And there's a problem with that. Because if you can't acknowledge what you're doing, you cannot learn the right lessons on how to reduce the risk in future crises. But politically, it's very difficult to accept it. The final point I'll make here is that there is one big problem in this entire crisis management that I studied. The US, China, Russia, UK, everybody shows up telling India and Pakistan to back off, de-escalate, not fight during a crisis. But there is no attention paid to deeper dispute resolution. You come in during a crisis, you try and separate the two sides. As soon as the crisis is over, everybody goes back their merry way to figure out what they're doing. So the example I give colloquially is if you think about two people fighting in a field, standing in the ground and fighting as university students, as all of us have probably seen during our lifetime. When do those two people become the most belligerent? When are they shouting at the top of their voice and saying, "Ke bas ab nahi main chhodunga, ab I'm going to take you down"? When does that happen?
When people step in.
Sorry?
When people step in.
When people step, when you have a crowd. जब आपको पता है कि अब लड़ाई नहीं हो सकती, फिर आप कहते हैं अब नहीं छोड़ो. This is exactly how the crisis plays out.
But the crowd can also encourage you to fight and enjoy the fight.
Wait. Let me get to this. Let me get to this. This is exactly how the crisis plays out. In this case, you are so sure that the crowd will show up because of the nuclear element, that there is even an incentive to create a crisis to bring in the crowd. Right? You can literally start shouting to get the crowd in if you feel that the crowd will support you against the other guy. So far, the evidence is that the crowd actually doesn't support either one. They just force both sides to pull apart. They actually don't enjoy the fight because of the nuclear element. But once the crisis is over, once both sides, both the people who are fighting have gone their merry way, it's very seldom that the crowd says, "Can we get together and figure out why this happened so that they don't fight again?" It almost never happens. The crowd also disperses, and that's the end.
So why is that?
And that's exactly how this comes together. The reason it happens is that during a crisis moment, it's the nuclear element that drives the entire interaction. Once the nuclear risk recedes, you go back to normal foreign policy and alliance preferences, in which case you could side with one side or the other. And in South Asia, of course, the US interest or the US position is that we will not get involved anymore in dispute resolution. And the Chinese position is exactly the same. So that's essentially what the book studies. So if you read the book, it will give you gory details of how the Pakistani Prime Minister did this, or the Army Chief did this, what the Indians did to respond, what the US did, and how that played out. And some very interesting anecdotes of what we wouldn't know publicly. So that's the book. I will stop here, and I'm happy to have a conversation later on if people have more questions. To segue into Pakistan-US, I'll join the book with that to make one point. In the crises, it is debatable who came out ahead and who was behind. Kargil, definitely, India benefited much more than Pakistan. The other two, one can debate where we ended up. But overall in the 18 years, I think there is no question that diplomatically Pakistan has been hurt much more with the way the crisis played out than India has. I'm not saying it's right, wrong, fair, unfair. I'm just making a very clear factual statement that when I interviewed people in Pakistan and India, the smartest ones on both sides agreed with this one. That diplomatically in 18 years, one side has clearly had the advantage over the other. And we can talk about why. But this is my segue into the US-Pakistan relationship, where our conversation has for the longest period been US is unfair, US is fickle, it's not trustworthy, US says Pakistan deceit, Pakistan lies, Pakistan, everything we've heard. But there is a very deep feeling of angst and being upset at each other in this relationship. I sit in Washington DC, I talk to people in Islamabad and go very regularly in Pindi, etc. And what you find is these two friends who are really hurt. You promised me something, you didn't give it to me. And very quickly the conversation becomes emotional rather than rational on both sides. And so I do this for a living, look at this every day. And my number one conclusion on the US-Pakistan relationship is that this idea that it's a bad friend, it's untrustworthy, etc., is really a cover for the real reality in this scenario, which is that just like any other relationship, this is a very cold-hearted, realist, transactional relationship in which US and Pakistan's interests do not converge. It's as simple as that. There's no rocket science behind it. If you remove all this sheen about bad guy, I don't like him, lies, cheats, whatever, The fundamental reality here is that since 9/11, the relationship has been built around Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, the US and Pakistan have a divergence, not a convergence of interests. That's fundamentally what it is. Again, all of these are my personal views, definitely not USIP or any government or anything, but to explain to you why I say this. I also make the point that both sides accuse each other of being irrational. In fact, both sides are brutally rational, and that rationality is driving them to a collision because the interests don't converge. Why so? Where we have stood in this relationship is that the US went in to defeat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and then brought together a nation-building kind of idea that I am going to create a modern state in Afghanistan, there will be democracy, there will be stability, a liberal sort of value system, if you will, in that conversation. In that, it wanted partners in the region. And the one necessary partner that it could not execute the war without was Pakistan because of the geography. It simply could not go around that. But the one partner it never trusted was Pakistan because of the perceived links that Pakistan had with the Taliban. So, no country actually had more cooperation with the US than Pakistan till the focus was on defeating Al-Qaeda. No other country has actually helped the US more than Pakistan on Al-Qaeda. The US could not have executed this war without Pakistan. I think it is also equally incorrect to say that Pakistan ko to kuch mila hi. It's actually incorrect to say that. There's a lot of diplomatic support in those years. There was a lot of assistance, whether it was enough, used rightly or not, separate debate. Once the conversation shifted from Al-Qaeda in the initial years to Taliban and nation building, the interests completely diverged for two reasons. One, Pakistan's number 1, 2, 3 problem is India's influence in the region. Not the Taliban, not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a function of what Pakistan perceives is India's influence in Afghanistan post 9/11. Second, Pakistan's worry throughout was that if Afghanistan falls apart, the history of Afghanistan is that everybody has played a proxy in that country. Everybody's had their own sort of, sitting on the chessboard and their own sort of support base in terms of a proxy group and used that to settle scores. Pakistan has had no political influence in Afghanistan for a long time, minus the Taliban, because of the 90s and how this played out before that, the Mujahideen, etc. And the worry for Pakistan was that if I go and do this hard-hitting action against these guys, one, they will turn against me. So the whole backlash of 2008, 9, 10 may come back. And second, what do I get in return? What I get in return, if the ultimate US objective is completely met, what I get in return from Pakistan's perspective, I'm not saying again it's right or wrong, is a perpetually India-influenced Afghanistan. Why should I support that? That's how the Pakistani state was thinking. Again, we can talk about whether it should have or not is a separate debate. And second, if I try to do this hard-hitting operation, neutralize the Taliban, this and that, and if it still doesn't solve Afghanistan, because Pakistan's view for the longest period has been that the real problem in Afghanistan is within Afghanistan, not Pakistan. If Pakistan does what it's being asked to do and still Afghanistan falls apart, the blame will still come on Pakistan, and now these actors would have turned against Pakistan. So why should I actually go in this direction? That was Pakistan's mindset. The US mindset was that ultimately whether Afghanistan falls apart internally or not, there are certain people who are creating a problem for me, including killing people who are my allies, good allies, bad allies, whatever, which you have control over or you have influence over. If you don't do what I'm asking you to do, I see you playing a double game. I see you supporting me, but I also see you not doing what I'm asking you to do. And for that, I have the right to punish you. And by the way, I want stability in Afghanistan, and your India problem is exaggerated. I don't believe your India problem. You have an India problem, but what we are trying to achieve in Afghanistan is not an India-controlled Afghanistan, and what we will get to is a peaceful Afghanistan that will benefit everyone. That was the US view. The clash in this is history. Pakistan believes, or the state, or many who decide for the state believe, that the US will get me to do its dirty work, and then like 1990 say, thank you very much, now you deal with the mess. The US view is that unless the Taliban under Pakistan's influence or in geographical control or proximity or whatever are neutralized, Afghanistan cannot be resolved. And Pakistan fundamentally disagrees with that view. Pakistan's argument is you solve Afghanistan within Afghanistan, the problem is not. And that clash has basically led the two sides to continue to tell each other, you are bad friends, you're irrational, you don't do this, you don't do that. In fact, both have calculated very clearly that what the other wants is not in my interest. And that's what you've seen play out. Now, the question is, if that's how bad it is, why not break this relationship? And the example I always give for an American audience is that the Pakistan-US relationship is like that bad marriage where childcare is so expensive that divorce is not an option. So every time you think about enough is enough, you look at the bills and you say, nahi yaar, baat nahi banti. But then every time you are in every form together, the conversation is a negative one, reminding each other of how bad they are. And that's exactly the relationship. Without Pakistan, still the war cannot be executed. So the idea that the US can say, thank you very much, I'm gone, cannot happen till Afghanistan is alive. For Pakistan to have itself isolated from the world's only superpower is essentially inviting more and more trouble. So Pakistan's approach to this is less, as far as I can see, a good relationship with the US and more about avoiding the worst of the US. That's essentially how this comes together. Okay? Now let me make one more point here. Everything I've talked about has nothing to do with US or Pakistan. I don't know whether you've noticed it or not. I've been talking about a country called Afghanistan. And this is the tragedy of this relationship. For the past decade, all we have been talking about, or at least the 6 or 7 years since the Kerry-Lugar bill kind of fell away, all we've been talking about is Afghanistan. Today, there is no US-Pakistan bilateral relationship. There is no relationship. It's completely broken. All conversations they have is about Afghanistan. And the idea is, once Afghanistan is resolved, then we will talk about US-Pakistan. So in a very odd way, this is all a sideshow. And therein also lies another contradiction. There's a paradox. Until you resolve Afghanistan, you can't improve the US-Pakistan bilateral relationship. But if Afghanistan is resolved whichever way, what is the relationship? Because the alliance structure is now US-India and China-Pakistan. So there's another paradox that neither side has been able to resolve on how to sequence this problem of Afghanistan versus US-Pakistan. Let me end this by saying that for the first time, I feel there is a genuine possibility of convergence in Afghanistan. It's not a contradiction. It may sound so, but for the first time, there is a genuine convergence. Why? Because for the first time, the goalpost has moved from neutralize the Taliban to find a political settlement with the Taliban. The US has made that public. For the first time, a barrier has been broken where the Taliban did not agree to talk to the Afghan government. They only wanted to talk to the US. The US and Taliban have met directly. It's been reported in the press. And there are also press reports that the Taliban have met representatives of the Afghan government. That barrier has been broken. Pakistan's view for the longest period has been, I cannot fight them, I can help you talk to them. The US has appointed a special envoy in the State Department to start the process of these negotiations. Now is the time where the US and Pakistan can sit together and decide on a vision on how do you get to a political settlement in which the Taliban are included. What can Pakistan do to help those talks? What will the US do? What will the Afghan government? There will be a lot of disagreements in this still, but at least now you are talking about the one thing that can actually bring the US and Pakistan together, which is how do you start a process in which you can bring the Taliban into the political system rather than keep them out. And that's where I feel the last week has been spent. I don't know, I have no information, but I think all conversations between the Pakistani and US delegations in New York, and of course the foreign minister is coming to Washington next week, will be about this one point agenda. How do you get a political process going? What will Pakistan do? What will the US do? If we can find a way forward in this, I think that's the best way to get over this divergence and quickly move to the bilateral conversation. That is ultimately the goal of both sides, which is to get back to the US-Pakistan relationship. If you give me 5 minutes, I can talk India. If not, I can stop.
No, please.
If I've already put people to sleep, I will stop.
I think 5 minutes at the BOI.
India. We have seen what happened. There was going to be a meeting of the foreign ministers. India cancelled that on a fairly odd pretext. And then they didn't meet at Anga. And if you look at all the analysis in Pakistan, it is that Prime Minister Modi is going to election next year. Till the election, nothing can happen. And that's why India has pulled back. This is a conversation we have often, and my point of view has been very consistent on this. आज इंडिया का इलेक्शन आ रहा है, कल पाकिस्तान का आ जाएगा, फिर कोई स्टेट इलेक्शन आ जाएगा, फिर कहीं पे कोई टेररिस्ट अटैक हो जाएगा, तो ये तो प्रोसेस फिर ऐसे ही चलेगा. This is basically never ending, right? India has elections every 3 months. किसी न किसी स्टेट में इलेक्शन हो रहा है. पाकिस्तान का कभी कुछ हो जाता है, कभी कुछ हो जाता है. That's not the outcome. And I think sometimes, quite frankly, I find the analysis in Pakistan to have a bit of a failure of imagination, and a lot of the conversations we tend to have are tactical in nature. He did this, so I did this, and this is how it happened. I think this has nothing to do with the elections. Of course, elections are on the mind of the Indian government and all of that. I think India is playing a long game in which this is a strategic question to answer, not a tactical question. And the long-term game, to my mind, is very simple. Again, very rational. Again, I'm going to be provocative, but I'm happy to talk about this. Basically, I think the current Indian government's mindset, if you look at the people in the Indian government, they have been fairly hawkish on Pakistan throughout their life. It's a fairly right-wing nationalist government. I think I have no evidence, this is analysis, they have made a very conscious decision and been very public about the fact that they want to isolate Pakistan globally. What is the logic behind it? Because Pakistan cannot be isolated, right? I mean, there's China, there's all sorts of issues. So why are they doing this? My analysis on this tells me, and there's enough data that I can quote, that India's basically made a decision that if India can do what I've been doing for the past 15, 20 years, and if I can somehow force Pakistan to do what it has been doing for the past 15, 20 years, in a decade's time, the differential between India and Pakistan, the power differential will be so large that I can basically deal with Pakistan on my terms. If you unpack that, basically it boils down to a very simple thing. If India can grow its economy, we can debate whether it will happen or not happen. If India can grow its economy at 6%, 7% over the next 10, 15 years, whichever way it does that, it's another matter that I think that is probably unlikely, but I'm trying to explain to you how they may be coming at this. And if Pakistan can remain bogged down in its traditional security paradigm, which forces it to keep the region locked, which forces it to worry about the Indian presence in Afghanistan, Indian presence in Kulbhushan Yadav, in India and everything else. And if Pakistan's attention is distracted from its human security and economy to this hard security problem that it has with India, it will continue to grow at 3%, 2%, 3.5%, 4%, whatever it is. And my economic differential and thus military expenditure and the differential there in 10 to 15 years would have grown to a point where I actually will not need to negotiate as an even partner. And thus my hand will be relatively strengthened vis-a-vis Pakistan. What do I need to do for that? What I need to do is every 2 or 3 months, something would happen whereby Pakistan says कि यार ये देखो ये कर रहे हैं हम इनसे बात कर सकते हैं और जब बात करें तो आप कहेंगे हम तो नहीं बात करते आप again please I want to be clear I'm an analyst and I'm presenting to you this rational perspective on where I think things are going. I'm not saying India is good or bad or Pakistan is good or bad. I'm presenting to you my calculus of how I think South Asian geopolitics is playing out. In that, one thing that works for India very well is that the global narrative is on India's side. Again, there's no point debating whether it should be or not. It's just a reality that the global narrative is on India's side. And thus, if you project this linearly forward, I think in 15 years India would get to that differential. I'm somebody who works very closely with what we call the track 2 space. These are sort of interlocutors, policy makers, retired officials, not government people but close to government, who meet privately to figure out how to solve things. In that, I've seen a very clear change in the Indian attitude in the conversation, even now. From a conversation of what should we do and how, to a conversation of deal with this as we are saying or else wait 10 years. And then you will have to deal with this in that sense. I'm not again saying it will get there, but that's sort of the approach. So what does Pakistan do? If that's the question, the final question to answer. In my view, and this is a very difficult argument to make because the obvious reaction is कि अच्छा जी वो ये कर रहे हैं और आप हमें कह रहे हैं कि हम लेट जाएं. That's not what I'm saying. I think the only possibility for Pakistan to close this gap and differential is to change its strategic orientation from a geosecurity perspective to a geoeconomic perspective. If Pakistan can make itself into a genuine transit hub of the region, where energy pipelines that both Pakistan and India have signed on to already, Casa 1000, TAPI, etc., are coming from Central Asia, and again, whether it will happen, Afghanistan is unstable, all of that. But I'm giving you the examples of what I have in mind. Connect to Pakistan and India. The estimates will tell you that you would have anywhere between 5 to 15 million Indians, depending on gas that is going through Pakistan. If we can connect CPEC north-south, you have a major part of the economy that's coming into China going through Pakistan. If there is overland route to India from Afghanistan, if India is sending goods and Afghanistan is sending goods and Central Asia is sending goods, the next morning you would have a natural death of the Chabahar port, which creates big problems for Pakistan. Pakistan argues it's a competitor port to Gwadar. This is the port that Iran has created with Indian support, etc. Why? Because the port is uneconomical, and the reason it is viable is because the overland route is closed. Right? Again, the argument is not that we late jayenge. There could be any number of security buffers created. Who can do it? Truck kiska hoga? Kaun jayega? Kaise jayega? Jo ki by the way abhi bhi hota hai. The Wagah border actually is used. Pakistan will then in return get access to Central Asia. Right? And you create yourself you put yourself in a position where other countries are so interdependent that they do not want Pakistan destabilized. And then of course there is trade and there is special economic zones and transit fees and everything else. The economic boost from that is going to be fairly major. And I'm happy to sort of discuss more. I know people will have questions about this. Last point, we talk about CPEC as the game changer. It is a game changer. It could be a game changer if the implementation is right. Although it could also have many problems if it's done wrongly. So we'll see where we end up. But one Pakistani view I hear, that I'm not saying I subscribe to, I hear a lot, is that the world wants to take CPEC down. The world is not happy with CPEC, Western countries, India, etc., etc. Let's take that argument at face value. Let's say that the world is not happy with CPEC. precisely because of that, the logical next argument would be that the world will try and undermine CPEC, right? If you do not like it, you're going to undermine it. How do you prevent that? If you create a scenario in which China, Pakistan versus the rest of the world will have a greater incentive to undermine CPEC. So to ensure that they don't do that is also the way to get to interdependence, right? If you create interdependency, if the entire world is investing in CPEC, if India is investing or has this transit issue with Pakistan, their interest in undermining CPEC is going to be lower, not high, because everybody is benefiting from it. If Pakistan and China become an isolated camp versus everybody else has a much greater interest to do what many in Pakistan feel is already happening. So even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is true or not true, even if that were true, the geo-economic hub argument that I'm providing you is probably the way to reduce or lessen or minimize the possibility of that undermining. Let me stop.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. So, let also, as Dr. Saab earlier asked, I think Urdu is good means of communication. Everybody understands Urdu. So we can begin the Q&A session. Dr. Saab is here. We have about 30 to 40 minutes more, and I think if anyone has questions, please raise your hands, and we can take it from here onwards.
Dr. Saab, why does the CPEC does not make a converging interest with the United States? The question was why CPEC does not make the converging interest with the U.S. and U.S. now beginning to solve Afghanistan problem. It's showing there is some converging interest. The CPEC has a role, as a reason to play that?
I think that's a very good question, and the answer is yes. If we look at how CPEC is shaping up, it is already being extended to Afghanistan. China has made it clear that they want to extend it to Afghanistan. The US wants Afghanistan to have economic sort of progress within the country. And CPEC is a natural routing of a trade and transit route that can easily extend to Afghanistan. Right? Afghanistan's internal revenues are not high enough to actually sustain the economy. The problem is that somehow the US and China have to isolate their larger, increasing great power competition from their convergence in Afghanistan. And there was an effort made called the Quadrilateral Group. It was China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the US, precisely to see how we could come together. Unfortunately, that fell apart. But I think the goal has to be to go back to some formulation where China, Pakistan, or CPEC, and US and Afghanistan can cooperate to see how the benefits could go to Afghanistan and Pakistan, of course, and then interdependencies increase between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think if we start having a real political settlement conversation, this will be one big point of conversation.
All right, quick question for you. You talked about the shift of focus from security to economics. In your estimation, what kind of appetite is there in Pakistan's military establishment to allow such a shift to happen? I mean, they've been the primary power broker in the country. They would be ceding a significant amount of power with this shift. What type of appetite is there for that?
So, look, I mean, first of all, no status quo power institution in the world voluntarily gives up power. I mean, that's just how it is. It's military or no military. So the way to do this is not to say to a status quo power institution, give me your power. It is to figure out how all boats rise. So the national economic pie would increase in a way that everybody could get more. The other part of this is, quite frankly, I will tell you from personal experience, about 5 years ago when I used to make this argument, people would basically shout me out of the room. "Yaar, tum pagal, wahan kya ho raha hai, tum kya baatein leke aa gaye?" Now I find virtually everybody who matters in Pakistan, civilian, military, civil society, all of them will say what you're saying is actually where we need to go, is inevitable, it should happen. But then we have a long conversation about why it can't happen, what are the constraints, why is this happening, etc. And there are shades of views there. So I don't think this is going to happen overnight. I don't think it should happen overnight. There are a number of things that you have to put in place. Conceptually, I think everybody recognizes that the status quo is not tenable. The other thing you have to keep in mind is policy should never be based on the hope of somebody else's failure. Policy should be based on your own success. ठीक तो अब ये argument के इंडिया को ये हो जाएगा, फ्रांस को ये हो जाएगा, maybe not. लेकिन आपकी policy has to be based कि आप क्या कर सकते हैं to get to where you want to get to. And in that I find a conceptual convergence across the board. That ultimately Pakistan has to move towards geoeconomics. And I would also say CPEC is an example of it. It is actually a diversification strategy which opens up the geoeconomic space. The only problem is, if it is seen as China-Pakistan versus US-India, then it defeats the purpose in some ways.
So my quick question here. You said that Indians are assuming that in 10 years or so, they will be able to dictate terms.
Maybe assume. That's my analysis.
That's your analysis. And they are getting to that conclusion by extrapolating the current conditions. You said that. But the past 10 or 15 years, they have been probably the worst part of Pakistan's history, with all that terrorism and so forth, and more than $100 billion lost in capital just by direct terrorism and so forth. So this extrapolation may be delusional.
May well be. When states decide on long-term policies, certain assumptions are made. That's just how any forecasting is done. I think the distinction I draw here is that I don't think I said that India is hoping that this will happen. What I said is that if India could continue to do what it's doing and force Pakistan to do what it has been doing, then you've got a problem, right? And the forcing part essentially comes from regional geopolitics. If Pakistan, rightly or wrongly, continues to perceive that Afghanistan is controlled by India, because India wants to create a two-front situation, Pakistan's response will remain wedded to the security paradigm. If you find a Kulbhushan Yadav every 3 months who is doing this, that or the other, and you find evidence that that's true or whatever, the security mindset continues to take over the argument that we need to shift. So the point to understand is, the shift from geosecurity to geoeconomics continues to become tougher and tougher as the regional dynamic continues to go against you, because you become more and more insecure with what is happening around you. So the argument is not that it was the worst period and now better periods will come. The argument is, how do you transform into that better period by moving away from the security paradigm that was forced upon by the situation in this period, right? That's the shift. And the shift becomes more and more difficult as the region becomes unstable and you become more insecure, right? So imagine a scenario in which, hypothetically, Afghanistan completely falls apart. There's no way that Pakistan will look the other way and say it's not my problem. Every country will jump in and Pakistan will jump in, resources will be focused there. And thus, the real conversation will not happen. That's basically the argument. Whether it holds or not, we will see. The reason I went on this tangent, I want to explain clearly, is because all the conversation in Pakistan was that the current spat is because of Indian elections. And what I'm trying to explain is that is part of it, but I do not think that's the whole picture.
So actually, I had two things in mind. One you have already discussed in some detail, which were about the security paradigm to geoeconomic paradigm. And while there is some hope, but in general, if we see that from geosecurity, we are seeing that those who are doing it are now micromanaging things. We have so many reports that media is being controlled now much more. We have reports and we have seen that even the economy is being controlled more. CPAC might be an example. That it is basically when something happened, our army chief recently had to visit China and talk to their president about it. So this is one thing that how it will happen in such a controlled environment. So that is one thing. The other thing about Kulbhushan Yadav, he was captured and in our media it was shown as something very big has been done. We have all the proof, but Indians went to the international court and they must have a case if they are going into an international court. So I don't know what will happen, and I think it is going to happen in the next few weeks. So please give us some information about that as to what Indians have in their mind and how it will shape up.
On your second question, the international court proceedings are on a technical issue, which is that Pakistan denied this gentleman consular access. That's basically the reason this is in court is because India had asked for consular access and Pakistan denied it because he did not have the diplomatic credentials that require that. That's fundamentally the disagreement, and the court verdict is going to be about yes or no, not about whether he is guilty or not guilty. So that's a technical issue. The controlled environment, I think that's a very good question and absolutely correct. What I find is that Pakistan is going through a social experiment. Again, I'm going to be provocative, but that's okay. The social experiment is that we have tried various models of governance and nothing seems to have delivered. Let's try something different. So what is different? हमारे यहाँ जो debate है, the public debate, कि पाकिस्तान कभी नहीं ठीक होता क्योंकि जो आपके हुक्मरान हैं वो चोर हैं, डाकू हैं, पैसे ले जाते हैं, पाकिस्तान का कोई इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, वो दूसरों का नेशनल इंटरेस्ट चलाते हैं, फौज से लड़ाई हो जाती है, इसलिए मामले ठीक नहीं है, अगर ऊपर कोई ठीक आ जाए तो मामला चल पड़े. The second thing we realize is that the system cannot allow ऊपर कोई ठीक आ जाए, right? The politics is such that if you have a free and fair election, you will have the same people in one form or the other coming. So we tried the military regimes, supposedly it didn't work. We tried elections and politicians, supposedly वही लोग दोबारा आ रहे थे. In some ways, we also tried the hybrid model of Musharraf and Shaukat Aziz. So इस दफा क्या social experiment है? इस दफा social experiment है कि you create a scenario in which civil military are supposedly on the same page. उनकी लड़ाई नहीं है फिलहाल. And you bring somebody who is clean, who is not a thief, who is known to be committed, पाकिस्तानी है और वो उस तरह का नहीं है जैसे बाकी थे, family को नहीं लाया, चोर नहीं है, वगैरह वगैरह. And what you are seeing now is मैं experiment इसलिए कह रहा हूँ कि this is going to be the test of that hypothesis. आया हमारे मसाइल हल होते हैं by somebody who's clean, जो whatever Imran Khan is, and फौज से कोई लड़ाई नहीं है, फौज is fully backing the government to deliver. आया यही मसला है, या अगर ये मामला भी नहीं चलता, then the conclusion must be कि the problems have become so structured and so deep-rooted that it's very difficult to turn them around with any kind of social experiment. Then you have to go back to the same argument कि जी 30 साल process चलने दें तो फिर देखें क्या आता है वगैरह वगैरह. So all of this to say कि वो जो control की आप बात कर रहे हैं, जो कि दुरुस्त है, that is part of this social experiment. Now whether this social experiment fails or succeeds, the next 2 years will tell us. But the experiment is very clear. और उसके अंदर the government की delivery जो है, वो हमें नजर आ जाएगी अब कि वो होती है कि नहीं. But इस वक्त I think the military's position as I see it is complete backing of the government to see if this social experiment works or not, or usme micromanagement ka element bilkul is part of it.
So, go ahead. Yeah. So you spoke about the global narrative being on the side of India and very effectively since 9/11. But I think that there is a deeper transnational narrative regarding fundamentalism. And you see the hijacking of the local national narratives, the local national narratives for self-determination by organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Boko Haram. And the Indian government, the Israeli government, the American government very effectively using those extreme elements to hijack that narrative. And Pakistan has paid a very deep price because they haven't corrected that narrative to suggest that the movement in Kashmir or the movement in Gaza or what is happening to Muslims in the U.S. has nothing to do with that extremism, but that there are legitimate grievances that need to be addressed. So I want to know from your research work, how have you found this to play a role in Pakistani narrative, and what can be done to separate the two so that the genuine grievances of people can be addressed with a global narrative?
Good question. So, I mean, one thing is absolutely correct, that anytime you create a black and white, it will be hijacked. Yeah, it's just as it happens every time, and has happened. In Pakistan's case, look, I mean, in this environment, you always have norm setters and norm followers. And countries like Pakistan are norm followers by size, by design, by how you set it. I would argue on three pillars essentially. One, a large number of countries, Pakistan included, are still operating their policy machinery as if they're in the Cold War. The digital divide we talk about in societies has actually also affected nations, states. And Pakistan is squarely on the lower side of that divide because, you know, the Pakistani sort of setup remains very, very bureaucratic in that sense. The second part of this is that a lot of the narratives are driven by strategic interests. You know, I'll give you a personal example. I am somebody who, unfortunately, is one of the very few from Pakistan who are in the Washington think tank circuit. I mean, you can literally count the people, or reasons are different. But I'm also somebody who does not agree with the normal narrative on US-Pakistan in Washington. And vice versa, quite frankly, in Islamabad. So I'm equally, so I call myself an equal opportunity offender when it comes to this. So once I was actually talking to an Indian American scholar and basically whining and, you know, saying, you know, this is nonsense. I do objective work, I write what I think, and people, rather than challenging my views, challenge the individual. You know, that story. So he told me something very interesting. He said, look, because there are so few of you, you become the lightning rod for what is a very deeply distrustful and angry relationship. Right? So people can't point at it. So, and he gave me the example. He said, I started off in this town, Washington, D.C., when it was the Cold War. And at that time, anytime I would make the argument that India and US should be partners, the Pakistani side would get up and start saying, you know, he's not this and that and whatever, and I would be cut to size. And he said, 15 years later, the global environment changed. I didn't change my view. The global environment changed. India and the US became natural allies and partners, and I became the darling of Washington. Right? So there's also strategic interest attached to how narratives are created. And in this case, Pakistan is on the wrong side of the divide. Simple as that. Third, I would say, कि वो जो है कि कुछ शहर वाले जालिम और कुछ हमें मरने का शौक. We're also very good at that conversation. And so, there is a global narrative. post 9/11 terrorism is sort of the global enemy. And so there's one question about Kashmir, but there are many other questions about Pakistani policy and behavior that to the naked eye look suicidal. Right? The debate can go on why and how but there is a consensus in the world that certain groups are problems, and those groups to the naked eye in Pakistan seem to be enjoying a fairly good time. That adds to this question of how do you go. So मैं आपको अपनी किताब का example देता हूँ. I said that in 16 years there was one country that benefited and the other. The Mumbai crisis. Ten years down, the Mumbai trials are still ongoing. And again, this is not a legal argument कि कैसे हैं वैसे हैं. The point is that the world has looked at this to say this is a great example of why this country is part of the problem, not solution. Right? And the Pakistani argument over and over that I hear is कि जी वो Indians खत्म ही नहीं करना चाहते. And that's precisely the point. That if you can score a diplomatic victory every day, hey, great. India gave Pakistan MFN in 1995, most favored nation status, which means trade may you get preference. If you look at Pakistani exports since 95, there's a blip. It's hardly gone up. Because the non-tariff barriers are very high, political problems, all of that. But diplomatically, Pakistan has not given India MFN. So the argument that Pakistan is holding back trade is very poor. Right? So I guess what I'm saying is that there is this global narrative, there is that problem, Pakistan's a non-taker, not the setter. And then there is adding insult to injury by doing things internally that should not at all be done. And not coming clean and clear on what is the situation with this entire militancy movement. And what is the long-term plan, if not short-term, to figure this out?
So I think we have about hardly 20 more minutes left. So there is a question here.
First this, then I will come to you. Then I'll come after him to you. Then
yes.
So actually, you did what I wanted to do in the first place. I wanted to pitch for your book. You brought it up already. The book actually ends at divergence. It doesn't talk about convergence. Where do you think the convergence came from? Was it the movement of the U.S. position, or was it the movement in the Pakistani position? And what happens post this small little convergence where there is some slight convergence, right? Sure. There's the other question. The other question is, we have a lot of debt. Now, with 2%, 3% growth, which is pretty standard, we'd be able to get that growth very easily because the population is growing with that rate. So it's a very standard growth aspect. With even 5% growth rate, do we have any chance of being able to deal with this debt? Because without taking any further debt, we cannot grow any further. And it's a chicken and egg thing, right? We need to grow, and for the growth we need more funds, and for that funds, our serviceable debt goes up. So,
your first question on the convergence on the US-Pakistan front, the convergence comes from two things. One, a closing window of opportunity in Afghanistan. For Afghanistan itself. Afghanistan is potentially on the verge of a political crisis. There's a parliamentary election coming up in October that may not go well. There's going to be a presidential election. Once you have a new government in place, whichever way, there's no real incentive for a political setup because then you have 5 years to do what you're doing. At this point, for the first time, Afghan presidential candidates are going to run on a peace platform. So there's this window where everything is coming together, security situation is really bad, things don't seem to be improving, the politics is getting dirtier, and there are candidates who are arguing that I will bring you peace if you elect me. Once they're elected, who knows where that ends up. So there's a political dimension of Afghanistan that has opened up space. The security casualties in Afghanistan are record high, unsustainable. So it's understood now that this cannot go on. The insurgency is not losing. The insurgency is also not winning. The Taliban cannot march into Kabul like they did in the 90s, so it's a classic stalemate situation. And the most important part is that both Pakistan and the US ultimately agree that chaos in Afghanistan, total chaos in Afghanistan, will be a disaster for both. So one, it's this whole situation that's shaping up in a way that there's a greater incentive. And second, the position that the Taliban will not talk to the Afghan government and that the US will not talk to the Taliban without the Afghan government has moved. US and Taliban have talked directly, as publicly reported, and now there are also reports that Taliban have softened their stance on the Afghan government. So conversation का एक platform भी निकला है, और वहाँ situation ये है कि everybody is worried कि यार ये तो हाथ से गया. So let's do something now. So that's sort of the convergence. Whether we can cash in on it or not, as US and Pakistan, we'll have to wait and see.
Where is India in this?
In what?
In this convergence?
India and Pakistan don't converge on Afghanistan at all, short of the fact that even India and Pakistan, as I said, do not want total chaos in which they would have to fight the next civil war through proxies. Nobody has an interest right now in backing proxies to fight a full-fledged civil war. So I think that the only convergence between India and Pakistan is that if you go towards a political settlement, there are ways in which you can agree how India and Pakistan will coexist in Afghanistan. Right? Because the north and west of Afghanistan is very different than the south and east that Pakistan is worried about. What Pakistan can do, what India can do. You could come up with some arrangement if a political settlement process moves forward. By the way, let me also make a point that the Taliban are very interested in maintaining multiple partners now. They also do not want to end up like the 90s where they're completely isolated. So this idea that, Taliban with Pakistan and India with everybody else is no longer true. It's going to be a very complicated hodgepodge kind of arrangement, whatever we end up with. Your second question was? Debt. I'm not an economist, so don't take my word for it. From my reading of this, we have a structural problem. And the structural problem is our revenues are always lower than our expenditures. Simple as that. We don't export enough and we don't collect enough revenues as Pakistan. Every 5 or 7 years, you come back to this problem. It's a cyclical problem. Your GDP growth rates are actually not bad over time. They're actually fairly decent. But structurally, the economy can't sustain. In fact, if you start growing very fast, the economy overheats. And you start having other problems. Right? Interest rates have to be adjusted every time. Currently, you have a short-term balance of payments crisis. And the problem for any government in Pakistan is that they have 35% of the total national share through which they have to do everything called governance. Because the current account, salaries, etc., fixed, debt servicing and defense take away the rest. So for 210 million, it's that 30 to 40% that you have to utilize to deliver. And there's a 10-year-old study, I haven't seen any new one, so I'm quoting that. And don't hold me to it, I may get the number wrong. But basically, for everything called governance, you have $3 per capita available as the state of Pakistan. So there's no more discussion needed on it. Right? You keep coming back to this problem. Abhi jo short-term problem hai, that is of liquidity. Cash nahi. Isliye China, Saudi Arabia, IMF, this whole conversation. But the fundamentals of the economy, the revenue collection, in terms of taxes, some of the movements on the agriculture side, are actually stronger than they were when the PMLN government came in 2013. So if you can actually get past this current balance of payments crisis, in fact, the situation will be better than it was when we went to the IMF the last time when the PMLN government came in. But of course, the current problem is acute, much more acute than it was in the past, because the PMLN government actually ballooned the debt through policies that it pursued. Let me also make a point that it's not fashionable right now because of the conversation we have in Pakistan. The PMLN government nearly doubled the tax revenue. Right? So the cushion to go another double does not really exist at this point without fundamental overhauling of the system, which is going to take time.
We'll take the question here, and then this will be the second last.
We can only take
short
about
period.
not
You
more
can just
than-
take three.
Okay,
One,
three,
two,
okay.
and
Let's make it short because we only
We
got
can
10
talk
minutes.
offline.
Okay, I'll make it very short. The line of control. India and Pakistan have really fought so many wars because of that. Now, do you think that is more or less settled? That there is a de facto agreement that you keep whatever you have, we keep whatever we have, so why fight over it,
No, I don't think so at all. I think the agreement is we cannot fight a war. As India, Pakistan, the agreement is unsaid that if there's war, it's going to be mayhem. But short of war, that space is being utilized very actively every day. In fact, the last year and a half has been one of the most bloody ones on the line of control. जितनी violence ये अभी हुई है 2003 के बाद पहली दफा इतनी violence. I think Pakistan still remains very much wedded to the idea that Kashmir is unresolved and has to be settled some other way than by just agreeing on the LOC. If you ask me personally, I think whenever India and Pakistan get around to it, whenever that conversation goes, you will end up somewhere very, very close to the Musharraf-Manmohan Singh 4-point formula. The peace process of 2003 to 7, when basically the idea was soft borders on the LOC, Kashmiris can travel, autonomy, withdrawal of forces to a large extent, etc., etc. And then pending the final decision to a later time. I think that's probably where, whichever way we come at it, that's the compromise that will ultimately be made.
If this agreement is followed through, don't you think there will be a lot of economic benefits?
Could be, depending on how genuinely it is implemented.
Yes, my name is Mahmood Hassan. And
Your
my
mic
question
is off.
My name is Mahmood Hassan. My question is that what will be your message to Islamabad when it comes to this current race of nuclear warheads between Pakistan and India? According to some of the scholars from Kargil endowment and others, they are saying that Pakistan will be the third largest country to have the stockpiles within 10 years.
The whole book deals with that, quite frankly, and I think the message is very simply this. Anytime you get into a crisis, there is no guarantee you will get out peacefully. So both sides have to come up with not a crisis management protocol, but a crisis prevention protocol. How do you not have crises? Once you have a crisis, US, China, everybody will show up, try to de-escalate, but there are so many risks involved. And I'm not saying that tomorrow there was going to be a nuclear war or Mumbai, that's not the point. But you have to prevent crisis. And that gets into this conversation that dialogue is absolutely necessary to figure out how to prevent. Bilateral confidence building measures, escalation control, etc. The problem is one side sees dialogue as a concession. So you don't have dialogue. The other side says dispute resolution, first address that, you can't do that without dialogue. So we are stuck in that. But my one big conclusion in the book is crisis and risk go together. So the way to do this is to figure out a way to prevent those crises. And I have detailed about that. Ali.
So I wanted to ask you about the global narrative. How do you think PTI government can perform changing the narrative internationally, globally? And what do you think of the elected government right now? Where do you see, what is your prediction on that? And the last question would be Saudi and Iran relationship, how they influence Pakistan.
So second one I'll leave aside. I don't want to be political here and give my views on right or wrong. The first one in terms of narrative, I think this is a very new government still going through its learning curve. So it's going to take a while for it to figure out how to, it's also very nationalistic government, so it's not the natural sort of, communicator externally. But what I will tell you is that narratives are not created without some reality. Right? You cannot actually just create a narrative out of thin air. You can exaggerate a narrative, you can hide bad and show good, but you can't just create everything. Everything can't be fake news. So while you have to work on the projection, there are also some realities that have to change, right? We cannot have a situation in which it is globally known that Pakistan is going capital to capital looking for loose change, and still present Pakistan as a economically sovereign and nationalistic and self-righteous kind of conversation. So these things have to be worked internally, but then of course there is the argument of narrative and projection and all of that. On Iran and Saudi Arabia, is probably Pakistan's biggest foreign policy challenge in the next 5 years is going to be this, because Saudi Arabia of course wants Pakistan to become an active player in that Middle Eastern politics. Pakistan wants to kind of stay out because it can't upset Iran beyond a point. It can't, completely ignore Saudi Arabia, or, if not partner. The more economic independence, the more Pakistan has to deal with Saudi Arabia, because Iran is not in a position to do anything there. I think the position has continued to be balanced, and I think balance is going to become more and more difficult going forward. And if the balance is impossible, you will see Pakistan lean towards Saudi Arabia much more than it will lean towards Iran.
Okay, just last question. We are right at time, but I'll take your question. Ji, Mehdi bhai. Ji.
Basically, like you are talking about global narrative, and that narrative has developed over time. But in recent time, what we have seen, one of the acquisition from India comes on the basis of Hafiz Saeed, his presence and his independence and the way he operates in Pakistan. So what is your analysis on that as to why we are not able to do anything on that front?
My analysis is what I said earlier, which is there is a scanner on you, whoever you are, Pakistan in this case, but there's a scanner on you for certain things, right? You have a problem with somebody. What you expect that other side to do is either solve that problem, and if that party says, I cannot solve this problem for whatever reason, then explain, here is my plan to solve that problem, but it will take this much time, and this much time, and this is the way to do it. I am not privy to any inside information on the Pakistani or US side, so I don't know what the reality of why things are where they are. What I would say as an analyst is, it is not clear to me what the game plan is. And if the game plan is not clear, then the scanner will continue to pick up. वो जब आप X-ray से गुजरते हैं तो वो बोलता है कि side पे आ जाए. It will continue to do that because the thing that the metal is picking up is still active. Right? So I don't know what the inside is. What I know is that the starting point has to be, what is the game plan? What is the problem? What is the game plan? Now, why that has not happened, or if it's happened and the two sides are not agreeing, is the fundamental question. India, you can leave out of this because India's position is Pakistani state controls all of this. I think the US position is more nuanced. It understands that the control is not full, but it still asks, why is the X-ray going off? And that game plan has to be announced.
Yeah. Dr. I just have a quick follow-up from last night, what you were talking about, and just follow up the answer you gave to this question from here. You mentioned going to Saudi and China for a change is not a sovereign foreign policy. I'm just trying to understand why going to IMF is considered sovereign foreign policy.
No, it's not. It's not considered sovereign at all. You have to go somewhere because it's a cash problem. The question really is, what are the terms and conditions under which you get what you get, right? Ideally, no country wants to go anywhere to get it. In this case, Pakistan has to go somewhere. There's no question about that. IMF is a structured institution that will make you do certain things to get that money. Other deals can be opaque. I don't know what the Saudi deal will be, what the Chinese deal will be. Right now, the reason IMF is not being entertained is not because of the IMF. It It is because of the US-Pakistan relationship and the state of that. The only argument I would make if I were doing this in Pakistan is decide on what is best for the economy and development and go with that, irrespective of anything else. But of course, the political part of this is much more difficult because at the end of the day, you have to decide whether the US-Pakistan relationship allows you to do IMF if that's where it is. My own guess is Pakistan will sooner or later have to go there.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Thank you so much. This brings our event to the end, and Dr. Saab will be here, and those of you who have not bought the book and are interested, Dr. Saab will be here and he will sign the book. So we do have some books available.
That's not the reason I'm here, but
and before we end the session, I'd like to thank a few of my friends who always stand by me whenever we are organizing any event. My friend Ali Tatari in the back, Mustafa Tajri, many of you know him, and then we have our young volunteer Zaid in the back. So thank you all three of you. And again, thank you, Dr. Saab. It's a pleasure having you. I'm looking forward. So this brings an event to the end. Thank you. Thank you so much.